YouTube and similar platforms offer a treasure trove of content that can help you learn Chinese, whether you're watching videos in Chinese or exploring content about language and culture. But how can you get the most out of this resource at different stages of learning? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about YouTube and how you can use it to learn Chinese. And we're also going to talk about how to not use YouTube, or some activities that students like to engage in, but that are actually not that helpful. When you try to optimize something, it's always good to think a little bit about what you want to achieve first, what is your goal, and you can then evaluate how a resource or activity might help you reach that goal. As we shall see, this is very important when evaluating YouTube channels, because some of them might seem more useful than they are, and sometimes the opposite is also true. I think that broadly speaking, content on YouTube can be sorted into three categories. The first is learner-oriented content in Chinese. So this is something that someone has created and it's aimed at language learners. Sometimes it's for beginners, sometimes for more advanced students, but it's still aimed at language learners. This type of resource is helpful because it can be comprehensible. It's something you can make sense of, and the more you understand of something you're listening to, the more you will learn. And if you turn on, say, a movie, or if you watch a talk show in Chinese, when you just started learning, you will not understand anything and learn hardly anything from the experience. Then the next category is authentic content in Chinese. So this is still content that is in the Chinese language, but now it's no longer aimed at you. So authentic in this case means not learner-oriented, or in other words, it's native speakers producing something for other native speakers. Even though authentic content is certainly harder than learner-oriented content in general, this can still be used at a beginner level. For example, we have lots of music on YouTube that you can listen to and maybe eventually also study and learn the lyrics. However, a majority of the content produced for native speakers on YouTube and other similar platforms will be very hard for language learners, and so only accessible from, say, intermediate and up. And even so, you probably need a lot of scaffolding or other forms of support to be able to tackle this content. The final category is content in English about the Chinese language, about the culture, or maybe about how to learn Chinese. It's easy to make the mistake of thinking that learning about a language is the same thing as learning the language, but this is not true. So while watching a grammar explanation or listening to a story behind a Chinese idiom, or maybe enjoying a skit about cultural shock, all can contribute to your language learning. The benefits are limited if this is done in English. So out of these three categories of content on YouTube, I think the first two are very worthwhile. Engaging with content in Chinese, whether it's created for you as a student or for native speakers, is always good. The more you understand, the better, but as long as you're listening to and maybe reading Chinese, you will learn the language. Whereas if you keep listening to things in English, you will not develop your listening comprehension and you will not truly learn how words are used either, even if the video happens to be about that. You learn to listen, speak, read, and write by engaging directly with the language, not by learning about it. This does not mean that you should never learn about the Chinese language in English or that you should unsubscribe to my podcast, but it does mean that these things should make up only a small sliver of your total study time. For more about how to balance your Chinese learning, check out episode 94 when I talked about Paul Nation's 4 strands. As usual, I will also put links to these things in the show notes. So in the rest of this episode, we're going to focus on how to engage with content in Chinese on YouTube and similar video sharing platforms. I don't think you need advice for how to listen to, say, my podcast, and most people can just watch a video about a vocabulary item they're interested in, or a grammar explanation, or maybe something about culture. You don't need my advice to do that. The only thing I want you to keep in mind is that if you spend a lot of your study time watching that type of video in English, or indeed listening to my podcast, you are doing something wrong. Most of your time should be spent engaging with the language directly. It should not be mediated through English or some other language. So let's now turn to a step-by-step approach for how to learn Chinese with YouTube. First, explore new resources. There is a lot of content on YouTube, and it's unlikely that you have already found the best content. Still, this should also be kept to a minimum because, say, reading articles about the best YouTube channels or maybe looking at different fora for recommendations is not teaching you any Chinese in itself. But still, keep an eye out for new resources, and it's good to vary what you consume as well. I will post my recommendations for the best YouTube channels for learning Chinese later this autumn. So if you have recommendations, and this goes for even if you're listening to this after the article comes out, I'm always interested in hearing about the best resources, so please send an email to editor@hackingchinese.com or leave a comment on the article on Hacking Chinese. 2. Watch and listen. Now that you have some content, it's time to watch it, listen to it, or both. Depending on the length of the video, you might want to split it into parts, but I suggest listening through it once without any type of aid, just focusing on general comprehension. The goal here depends on the difficulty of the content compared to your Chinese ability, and so if this is something roughly on your level, you can obviously try to understand more than just the gist, but if the video is rather difficult, the first time just try to understand roughly what it's about, pick out some key words, and see how much you understand. There are many things you can do to make it easier, and I will get back to that later in this episode, but for example, watching is usually much easier than just listening, because on YouTube you have some kind of visual support, usually. It might be someone speaking, using body language, there might be images, and so on, and this clearly will make it easier to understand what the person is saying. This is indeed one of the major benefits of platforms like YouTube compared to other types of content, such as podcasts. 3. Watch and listen again. Now that you have some idea what this is about, at least, it's time to watch or listen to it again, and this time you will be able to understand much more than you were the first time. Listening to something again is a very worthwhile activity in general, and we talked more about that in episode 164 if you are curious. If you don't understand the gist after watching more than once, I think you need to find something easier. This content is too hard for you, and if it's very interesting, you can save it for later, but it's too hard for you at the moment. 4. Use scaffolding. And I mentioned this already when I said that beginners benefit from watching and not just listening, because the visual support is helpful. This is clearly not only helpful for beginners, so for example, if you're an advanced student and you watch the news, it is significantly easier to listen to a news story if you can also see related pictures compared to if you're listening to it without any kind of visual support. There are also other types of scaffolding, and some of them are built into YouTube, which makes them very easy to access. For example, there are closed captions, and you can also lower the playback speed to give you a little bit more time processing what it is you're hearing. You can also use third-party plugins or other programs to help you, such as using a pop-up dictionary or subtitles converted to pinyin and so on, but I will talk more about that later. 5. Download the audio. The main benefit with YouTube, namely that it is video and audio combined, is actually also the main drawback, because this means that unless you have a premium account, when you turn off your screen, the audio also goes away, and added to that you also need an internet connection. This limits when and where you can watch, and one solution to this is to simply download the audio. Unless you have premium, you can't do that without third-party tools, but make sure you follow your local laws and the terms of service. It is very useful to have the audio downloaded though. It allows you to listen in many situations where you otherwise couldn't. For example, I've found many audiobooks on Chinese video sharing platforms and downloaded only the audio to listen when I'm out running, walking, or something else. And finally, 6. Review on the go. As you listen to, watch, and study more and more content, you will be able to build your own personal Chinese media library, and revisiting content that you have listened to before is great for review purposes, and it's also easier than tackling new content, which makes it suitable for some listening situations where you don't really have the mental capacity or focus to tackle something difficult. This is something we talked about more in episode 181. Listen more and learn more by building a personal Chinese audio library. And as usual, links in the description. I mentioned Chinese video sharing platforms, and it's worth noting here that everything I've said so far works for other video sharing platforms too, and if you want authentic content, i.e. content produced for native speakers by native speakers in Chinese, your best bet is to go to Chinese video sharing platforms rather than YouTube. This can be particularly useful if you're looking for very specific content, maybe about a certain topic, or maybe you're looking for an audiobook or a specific show. Then looking at several platforms will make it much more likely that you find what you're looking for. If you don't know where to start, you can check out Youku, 腾讯视频, or maybe Bilibili, and I'll put links to these in the show notes. Before we round off this episode, let's talk a little bit more about scaffolding and how you can tackle content that is a little bit too difficult for you, because this will happen a lot. And it doesn't matter if you're a beginner or an advanced student, it will still happen all the time, so knowing how to deal with this is useful. So first, let's talk about playback speed. And YouTube allows you to adjust this, which means that the accompanying audio will also be slower if you lower the playback speed. This gives you more time to process what you hear, and that will also make it slightly easier. This is preferable over listening to someone who enunciates and speaks slowly in the first place, because then certain things happen with their pronunciation. They might pronounce tones differently, for example, and syllables interact less with each other, and sounds simply aren't produced the same way as they are when people speak naturally. If you lower the playback speed, however, you maintain all the tone changes and everything sounds exactly the same, you just have more time to hear it. Don't overdo it though, sometimes lowering the speed too much can actually make it harder to understand, and the sweet spot is somewhere between 75 and 95%. Try making small adjustments, they can sometimes have a rather big impact. Next, let's discuss closed captions and transcripts. So many videos on YouTube come with closed captions, either manually created or automatically generated. I recommend that you turn these off when you listen first if your goal is to improve your listening ability. This is partly for practical reasons, because it's simply harder to find good listening materials, and if you're reading before you listen or if you read as you listen, you are not actually listening in a realistic setting, so make the most out of the good listening resources you have. It's also for pedagogical reasons, because listening when you have supporting text available is simply a different thing from listening without that support, and in real life, at least so far, we don't have closed captions when people speak, so practicing without that is preferable. Still, having closed captions or a transcript available is always useful. You can turn it on after the first time you listen, or after however many times you want to listen, and then everything becomes easier. You can see the words you didn't hear, it's easier to look them up if you actually didn't know the words, and you can see how something was pronounced by checking the pinyin or something else. Naturally, pinyin itself is not built into YouTube, so you will get the closed captions in characters, but this can be solved with third-party tools that we're going to talk about next. If you use YouTube a lot to engage with content in Chinese, it's worth looking at the wealth of third-party plugins that exist to help you. Many of these are built specifically for language learners, and one example would be Language Learning with YouTube, which is a plugin to Chrome. This essentially expands the amount of scaffolding you get when you listen, for example by adding subtitles in your native language or including pinyin, and maybe also having a pop-up dictionary, which can be helpful. The third-party tools that are built specifically for language learning also usually has more customization, and you can change more settings than you can on YouTube, which is, after all, not designed to help you learn Chinese. You can also use services such as FluentU and Language Player, which allow you to interact with videos through a new interface, which is built specifically for you as a language learner, so you can get more out of the videos that you watch. Naturally, this type of scaffolding has its limits. Please don't take this as advice for beginners to start listening to native level content at, say, 50% the speed, with subtitles in pinyin and your native language, a pop-up dictionary available, and so on. While you can do that if you're truly interested in a video, this should still make up a very small part of your total study time. If you want to learn more about scaffolding, we talked about that in episode 180, 8 great ways to scaffold your Chinese listening and reading. So an obvious follow-up question to everything I've talked about in this episode is, which are the best YouTube channels for learning Chinese? And I don't know, or rather I have a good idea because I've spent a lot of time on YouTube both for my own learning and to help other students learn Chinese. But I can't check every single YouTube channel available, and so here is where I hope to get help from you. To make sure that my upcoming article about the best YouTube channels for learning Chinese actually contains the best YouTube channels, please leave your favorites in a comment on Hacking Chinese or contact me in some other way. Until then, spend most of your time engaging with content in Chinese, although, as I've said, it's okay to occasionally listen to a podcast about how to learn Chinese or watch a video where someone explains how Chinese characters work. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.